Hi, and welcome to this live stream on Web Piano Academy. Today, we are interviewing Nicole Di Paolo, and we will talk about Partimenti, Galant style, and composition stuff. So, tell us a little bit about yourself, and about your musical journey.
So I'm originally from the Detroit area, and as we say in the Partimento community, there's an oddly high number of people with ties to the Detroit and Ann Arbor area who sort of got sucked into this Partimento universe, and we're not entirely sure why, but I'm very happy to be part of that community. So anyway, I grew up near Detroit, in a half Italian American family, and attended my undergrad at the University of Michigan. And so I got to work with Kevin Corson while I was there, and he is also a big member of the Partimento community. And so I majored in music theory, did significant coursework in piano performance and composition, did my graduate degree in music theory at Indiana University, and I was there in a freelance and got into collaborative piano. So that's my main performance specialty now, is that I do accompanying, and it means I'm working with others on stage, usually singers, sometimes a violinist or a tuba player. Last night I just rehearsed with another pianist. I was playing the orchestra part of a concerto to prepare him for a competition. So collaborative piano is mainly where you'll find me on stage. But I also run a large online studio where I teach piano, music theory, composition, also historical composition and improvisation. That's where Partimento comes in. And so I'm really happy to be kind of doing all these things. Keeps me interested. And, I also do some church substitute playing. That's another thing that I've enjoyed doing. It's also been a really great outlet for all this historical composition and improvisation, because in the church context, you may be told that your pastor may tell you, hey, I forgot, we need an offertory, or the communion might go longer than we thought. And can you just keep something going during that time? And so
I find so useful music theory in while playing communion, because you can go on and on and on and on and on until the last person, and always end with the last communion. And they always wonder, how is it that you always perfectly end with the last person taking communion?
Well, exactly. You have to know how to pull a cadence out of nowhere by watching the priest or pastor. And now, because I'm piano only, I'm not usually playing in Catholic churches, although I've had a couple of Catholic gigs. So I've seen most denominations and how they do things, but it's incredibly useful to be able to improvise in a tonal style, usually kind of Baroque or Galant, although my teaching specialty as of late is sort of accidentally become taking these materials and actually teaching how to compose in a romantic style.
I was reading in your bio, and I was kind of surprised, and not so surprised, I just probably had forgotten, but you had started teaching online way before the pandemic.
Yes, I began teaching privately a little bit in 2015 online. I had probably, he counts as my first ever sort of Galant style composition student, because he was in another state. And then I started teaching for Liberty Park Music, which is kind of it's like a Netflix, that's how they bill it, because you subscribe and you have access to a bunch of pre-recorded videos, which they have libraries for instrumental performance lessons. And I think it worked especially well for music theory. So I did their entire music theory curriculum. And currently they have enough to cover a whole fundamentals class. And so that really got me into online teaching. In early 2019, I was then asked to take over the online sections of an introductory music theory class for non-majors that Indiana University teaches, and I still teach those sections. The great thing about them being fully online is it doesn't really matter where I am, because I'm currently in Nashville, but I still have these online sections. So I was familiar with Zoom before the pandemic, although I remember sitting in my department chair's office as she was showing me all the features and thinking this was this cool new thing. I didn't realize the whole world was going to be using it. And so those have been going ever since that time. It's a well-oiled machine. Get to work with a lot of great kids from across the university. And so when we moved to Cleveland in 2019, for my husband's job at the time, I was able to take some of my piano students that I had been teaching, and they came with me. And then after the pandemic had dragged on for a few months, and people started realizing, hey, Zoom teaching is actually kind of effective. I kind of like being able to sit here in my pajamas and take my lessons. Then I contacted a lot of my previous students who had moved away from IU, and we weren't in the same location anymore, and said, hey, would you like to join my online studio? And a lot of them took me up on it, and that's how I was able to jumpstart my online studio. And I was teaching a little bit in person at a couple of different multi-teacher studios, but for the past almost year, I've been fully online with my private studio, absolutely loving it.
Yeah. So now let's go back to the Partimentos and your composition, and that's fascinating to me because I love that. For whoever is not familiar with Partimento and how they were taught and how they developed, can you tell us a little bit? What is a Partimento?
Sure. So Partimenti were these instructional baselines. Usually, now there are also instructional soprano lines called solfeggi. So it was basically a fill-in-the-blank exercise for these kids who were going to these boarding schools. They call them conservatories. They're not conservatories like we think of them today, like Juilliard and Manhattan School of Music and all of that. These were for kids. And so these parents, usually, they didn't come from money. They would have a lot of kids, and then they'd realize they couldn't afford to take care of little Beppy or little Vinny. And they'd send them to conservatory and say, well, you can become a church musician, and no one will care that you're of peasant ancestry. If you're a church musician, you'll make a good living, and no one will care where you came from. And so these were kind of trade schools for kids in music. And so it was every single day they're learning, the grammar and the phrases of tonal music. And so Partimenti were these bass lines that would cue, okay, here's this lick that we're going to teach you. And so when the bass line does this, what does the soprano line do? Or something in the upper voices. And little Beppy should be able to play that. And then maybe little Vinny is singing the soprano line because he should be able to know by hearing that bass line, what the soprano line would be. Or, little Vinny is singing a typical soprano line, and then little Beppy needs to know what the bass line is going to be for that soprano line. And then they would be singing in mass every day, the church choir. And so it was all the time. I mean, they lived and breathed music. It was probably like an extreme Interlochen Arts Academy for kids. And all in the church. I mean, your priests and your nuns. So they got absolutely immersed. I mean, it was like an immersion language program. And so even kids who, you wouldn't necessarily call every kid extremely talented, but they would rarely have a kid who just couldn't do it because they were so intensive with the training. I mean, maybe I don't know what they would do for special education situations, but most of the kids did really well. And then the sort of higher achieving students could become like TAs basically. And sometimes, one might rise to the rank of being the master of the conservatory, or might be able to start another one. And so it was really kind of a musician factory at the time. You could even make a Partimento that would outline a fugue. Yes. So these would get really advanced, and better know your C clefs. So a lot of them were in all the C clefs. Now the problem with these is a lot of this instruction was passed down just through music and through oral instruction. So trying to reconstruct how these were ordered and sequenced, that's an ongoing task that the Partimento community is taking on because we don't have a ton of records. We do have the kids' notebooks that they copied. Unfortunately, a lot of them have errors because these kids were like 10, 12. They're going to make errors. But we're discovering a pretty good library of materials that are allowing us to try and reconstruct, how these things were sequenced and taught.
Yeah, I remember in the Italian Conservatory, my harmony teacher, harmony and counterpoint, he didn't use the textbook that much. He had his own notebook from his previous teacher and his own teacher, and that's how we learned, what type of chords we were going to use on the bass line through the notebook that he had from his previous teacher, which was very, very interesting. Then when I started reading about Partimento, I was like, oh yeah, probably that's going on since quite a few centuries. So
that sounds kind of like what Kevin did with us in our counterpoint class. So I was in an unusual situation. I ended up in that counterpoint class as a sophomore and thought I was completely in over my head. But he basically just handed things out to us. He would give us a box solfeggio and then say, okay, give this a bass line. And then he would show us, he would correct them and kind of show us the implications of what the soprano line would demand of the bass line. I had no idea these were called partimenti or solfeggi or what we were doing. He had us doing a couple of the Handel Princess Anne partimenti. I just remember in the Bach, I totally missed that there was supposed to be a fonte somewhere in the middle of the solfeggio, and he sort of was like, you want a sequence here. But it was. I know it was very similar to what was happening back then, and so I count him as one of my composition teachers just for the amount of work he did with us. But it sounds very similar to your teacher.
Let's connect a little bit the Partimento to the Galant style. So how do they connect? Or how are they related? Because when we talk about Partimento, then we connect to the Galant style, very often music theory. And for most people out there, the connection is not so clear, so we don't really know.
So Partimenti became a thing during the Baroque era, and the Galant style came right out of the Baroque era. I mean, it was a reaction to the sort of florid style. But the grammar didn't really change. And so in the Galant style, we're focused on making the licks very clear. So if you're a jazz player, you learn certain licks. The joke in jazz is that there's a lick. That's a lick. That's like a contained little motive that people joke is kind of everywhere. And I'm not sure how true that is because I'm not a jazz person. But tonal music has licks as well. And back in the conservatories, they would call them motti di basso. In French, they call them marche harmonique. I'm probably not saying that correctly. I should ask my student who's half French. These masters would teach, okay, well, if you have a bass line that goes, 4, 3, 2, 1, you can accompany that with... And then many, many years later in 2007, Robert Yerdingen shows up and he says, I'm going to call that a printer after this composer named Printer, who was kind of in the discussion. But I'm going to give it a name because that's going to make it easier to remember. And so that would be a lick that these kids would learn. Now, in the Galant style, they're just clearer to the ear than in the Baroque. Although, Bach loves himself a good printer because he'll go... This is a modulating printer, so it goes 1, 7, 6, 5, but in the key of 5, it would be 4, 3, 2, 1. So he goes, and I don't have the score, so if I don't have this correctly memorized, sorry, but... A modulating printer.
Yeah.
But that sounds pretty different from, the one that you'll get that opens Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 6.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not going to try to play because it has been years since I've played that and I'm going to butcher
it. Yeah. And so in the Galant style, they use this type of patterns and schemas over and over again. And then it's funny how composers would expand that and add more details, less details, and combine them together. I think different.
Yeah, you can mash them up and stack them. And I'm pretty sure that's the source of. So Mozart got some heat from his audiences because audiences would have been familiar with the licks because that this type of music was also their native language. But then he would start stacking them, and he would be doing all these schema mashups. And then his audiences would say, there's too much going on. It's getting confusing. It's a little bit like today. I don't know if you wander onto these reels on Facebook, but people will do mashups of two unrelated pop songs. And they say some brains find that enjoyable and some just shut down and find it overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I think they're cool. I mean, I don't know that much about pop music, but occasionally I can recognize that it's two different songs. But certain brains just don't like that. I think maybe Mozart just ran into some of those people.
Yeah, there's some of the pieces that Mozart wrote when he was young. And then, I don't know, if you start analyzing, for example, all the pieces in C major in 4 quarters and all those things, you see that how he evolved those things and he expanded these pieces and he changed them and transformed them over and over again. And that he was a master of transformation because you see that.
These things he was writing as a kid very much sound like every other dead guy who was writing at the time, and so they were very transparent. The young Haydn, if you go into the early volume of the Haydn sonatas, at least in the Dover edition that I think orders them properly, you can see they're a lot clearer in what they're doing because that was the style. And then things did get more complex, as the 18th century wore on. I don't know if any of if Mozart and Haydn would have anticipated Liszt and the Hungarian Rhapsody and all that splash there, although Liszt studied with Czerny, so he knew all his licks. Mozart had some of the best training in the world. You can certainly critique his dad's bedside manner with that, but he got great training and a lot of practice. Even though he wasn't in a conservatory system, he kind of got that at home. So he was affected by the way his dad trained him in the licks, or the schemata, as the fancy term. Yeah, he talks about, there was a letter he wrote to, I don't know who he was writing to, but he talked about kind of being able to see the whole outline of a piece as a whole unit. And so, and Bob Yerningen talks about that in Music in the Galant style, where he's kind of imagining the Partimento outline of a piece, because being able to just think of a few licks, that takes up less space in your head than having to memorize a bunch of individual notes. So it is easier to kind of hold things in your head. That makes improvisation a lot easier.
Yeah, but also it makes it easier to really understand even for young kids to understand, how music is structured and how can I imitate that? How can I use that template to write my own music?
Well, I'll say, I've done similar things with my students. I have a couple young Partimento students, or historical composition or improvisation or whatever. They're not necessarily playing at sight from Partimenti because they're chops, so they're reading. They're not up to that point yet, but yeah, we write minuets and we talk about what schemata we want to have for our first half, and then what schemata would work for the second half. And sometimes, they're starting to stack them. And they're writing really plausible tonal style music. It's only if the student has kind of expressed interest in that language, and that kind of happened accidentally because several years ago I wrote Venturing Beyond, which is a collection of pedagogical piano pieces for my mostly adult students who wanted something that sounded more grown up than a lot of the student music out there. Yeah. And my aim was to make music available in unusual keys. So anything with 3 or more sharps or flats, because a lot of these adults learn to read faster than their fingers learn to develop good technique. And so, I saw a need. This was 2013, 2014. I wrote a lot of the set when I was on my cruise ship performing gigs. And so a lot of that book is in romantic style. A couple of them are more clearly 18th century because there's a fugue and a minuet. But this book has been out there. It's enjoyed some success. And so I think if left to my own devices, I would write in kind of an early 19th century style. So that was already there. And then last year, I learned of a call for scores where EVC Music, Elena Cobb's publishing company, was soliciting nocturnes by women composers in homage to Chopin. This is for a project at Rose McLaughlin at the Royal Northern Academy of Music, Royal Northern College. It's one of the I should know. So she was soliciting these commissions for a kind of a Chopin homage project, and I had a fragment that was kind of Chopin in style, and I said, I think I can use this. So I sort of set myself a task to use principles of Partimento and schemata, and then kind of challenging myself to turn those into something in the style of Chopin, and I think it's pretty hard to imitate. But Chopin was trained in that stuff by Mr. Elsner, his teacher from Germany, who came to Poland, and Warsaw Conservatory. You know, those Eastern European conservatories, they don't play. He was trained really well. And yeah, they still don't play. And so I wrote this nocturne and I submitted it. It was one of the 16 that was chosen. There were 6 more that were commissions. And so that has been published. It was published last month. It is being premiered on Monday, September 18th. So Rose will be giving the book launch recital. And so it's been published in a volume. It's, you know, roughly UK exam grades 6 through 8, something like that. And so it's a really nice preparatory library to prepare for Chopin's nocturnes. Some of the other pieces are not so much Chopin in style. They're just kind of inspired. Mine was, I thought, pretty on the nose, maybe a little more John Field than Chopin. You know, a little earlier, a little more transparent in style. But I suppose at least I got the stamp of approval from these guys that, you know, I managed to get these schema and Partimento principles into a piece, you know, whose surface elaborations sound much more early romantic. And, you know, there's always great need for Chopin preparatory repertoire. So then, yeah, I was interviewed by Nikhil Hogan, who runs a great podcast for Partimento and also jazz. That's his other interest. And so that podcast interview got out, and then I think people started noticing, oh, okay, we can use these principles to write in a romantic style. You know, I'm not really interested in writing like Bach, but I kind of want to write like Chopin. And so, you know, I've been getting some interest because of that. Although I know a guy wrote a dissertation at Northwestern about Elton John using certain schemas in his music. And so I think pop has started to evolve a library of schemas, and you know, maybe someone like Lizzo, who she was a flute major before she sort of diverted into pop music. You know, I hear that transformed classical licks in her music. I mean, I don't really know it. I'm not really in that universe, but I know she picked things up from all the flute repertoire she had to play. And, you know, there are certain pop chord progressions that we almost make fun of how similar they are. And I'm sure that has become a schema, you know, where you go like 1, 5, 6, 4. And there's the whole Pachelbel rant that is that, or, you know, 6, 4, 1, 5. I mean, if you can play those chords, you can play 90% of pop music. So
yeah.
You know, those are things that people still use. I mean, the library of schemas is going to look a little different than it does for, you know, a Mozart or a Schubert or a Liszt.
Right. But I mean, but still, if you, for example, I think if you would like to write some pieces in Liszt style, okay, so you analyze Liszt, you start taking things apart, you start, you know, looking for patterns, repeated things, and then you modify those things, and you have your little like Liszt piece. It's not, we don't think about that, but I think that many more people could attempt composing or writing their own music if they would think in those terms instead of just like being the recipient of the music that somebody else has written.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a, I mean, it's not dedicated to sort of Partimento and Liszt, but there is a tone-based video. If you look up on YouTube, Yunchan Lim laughs in the face of the hardest piano piece because he's playing Fufale, which 99% of pianists are terrified of. And so, Ben does a nice job of breaking down, here's what makes this guy's interpretation unique. And then he talks about the evolution of the piece itself and shows, the earliest version of the etude, which Liszt wrote when he was like 15. So it sounds like Schubert. And all he's doing is taking a Fenaroli schema and then elaborating on it in kind of a Schubert-style way. But it's based on a Fenaroli. Now, it's the scariest Fenaroli on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a piece that, sometimes I make ill-advised repertoire decisions. I won't even touch that piece. But, so that's one pretty good. I mean, it's not complete because it's sort of a smaller point within the larger video, but it does show, Liszt studied with Czerny studied with Beethoven. These licks got passed on. And, I like using Mazeppa for the Lully, which is John Rice's term for it. John Mortensen calls it the page one, but it's the Bach prelude, so you go 5-3.
Right.
If I could play that correctly, that would be great. This is, the 4-2 with the scale degree 1 on the bottom, and then your 6-5, and then your 1. So it's Uerdingen might call this a glorified comma because, but you have that juicy little 4-2 in there, and Mazeppa just does it in minor, so. So that's kind of cool. Kind of an interesting scale soprano there. I would say a great free resource curated by Robert Uerdingen himself is Partimenti.org. It's just a treasure trove of free materials that Bob Uerdingen and others have put out there. It also has typeset collections of Partimenti and some great definitions. I'm preparing a presentation for CollabFest, which is the collaborative piano conference happening next month. And I'm going to include some of those materials. They're open source. And so that's really just a great thing they've done. And I think it's a great starting point. It also has reviews of some of the important books in the field. Giorgio Sanguinetti's The Art of Partimento is like the textbook. He says there's a workbook that's coming up, I'm sure. Like publishing anything, it will take a while. But there are a lot of really excellent books. Also, Uerdingen's Music in the Galant style, very approachable. For a great history of how the conservatory system worked or how it got to France, Uerdingen also has a book called Child Composers in the Old Conservatories, and it's very approachable if you're not necessarily, an expert composer. As long as you have some musical background, I think you'll enjoy it, especially if you enjoy the French Romantic style and you're wondering, these basse donnée contests, these given bass harmonization contests, or these fugue contests, how did these get to France? And the answer is through the Neapolitan conservatory system. So if anyone who has an interest in that, I recommend that book. And so there's a lot of great material. But Partimenti.org, it's a really great basic place to start. They're doing the Lord's work, as the kids say. And so I'd highly recommend that. There are also some Facebook communities. There's the Art of Partimento and the Art of Schemata, both really friendly communities, where you can interact with some of the biggest names in the field. And so I highly recommend those. John Mortensen also has Improv Planet, which is the domain name is not really intuitive. So it's improvplanet.thinkific.com. So it's basically a website, a forum, and there was a historical improvisation conference hosted on it last year, which I was honored to be on the board for. And so the materials from that conference are still up. So it's freely and asynchronously available. And so recommend that. John is also a big name and just a great teacher of improvisation in historical styles. A lot of that involves Partimenti and schemata. So that's another great resource. And And I think those will get people started, with free and approachable materials. There is an open music theory chapter on Schemata. I'm going to have to, hopefully this won't break the stream because I have to navigate to it. But there's this great, so open music theory is a free college textbook, meant to just kind of keep college textbook costs down. And I think it's, they're doing the Lord's work. So here's the opening of the schema chapter. So this is freely accessible. And I like it. At the end of that chapter, they have an itemized list of Bob Yerdingen's schemata that you can just kind of scroll through. So it might be a little easier to navigate for some people.
Yes. So how would you suggest that they approach the learning process? So is it more practicing how to play chords and chord progressions and, or just in writing? But that's a question that they ask me very often. Should I do it in writing? Should I play that at the piano? Or is it a mixture of both?
Yeah, it depends on the student for me because, my students come in with all kinds of keyboard chops. I had a young student come to me just learning how to read music because she had been a Suzuki kid for a few years and reading was very delayed, as is design there, for better or for worse. So we had to do a lot of just playing them because she had to catch up in her notation skills. And I will accept students who are, I think, at earlier keyboardist levels than maybe some of my colleagues will. So in those cases, if they read notation well, but they're still developing their keyboard chops, maybe they're just earlier in their studies or they play another instrument better than the piano, then we'll do a lot of writing. And so we'll dig heavily into Jo Bejerman's Harmony, Counterpoint, Partimento, which is one of the books reviewed on partimenti.org. It is meant to replace a college textbook. And so I'll lean more into the writing and the sort of out of time exercises with those whose keyboard chops can't just get around to Partimento at sight. Now, if they're an advanced pianist, then yeah, we're playing right away. But it depends on their ability to make things happen at the keyboard. And in a lot of cases, their technique just needs to develop. Or sometimes they're not reading as well as they play yet. So yeah, totally customized to the student.
It's very interesting how every student can really develop some of those skills, and they would have never thought that it was possible. It's just like it's a matter of really being exposed to this type of teachings, like Partimentos. In the conservatories, many kids were not really, probably what we would call talented, but they still would develop the skill of composing music. And I think it is still possible to do that now if we would become more adventurous as teachers too, to propose those exercises to students.
Well, yeah, it's just like learning a language. You're not necessarily going to expect every student to become, Shakespeare in their second language. But although I guess they were getting these kids when they were young enough that it would still be a first language. But it does require a degree of immersion and commitment that I think is hard to find these days, unless the students' parents are musicians and they're just getting music every day in the home. Because now they're all playing sports ball, and sports ball is king, at least in the U.S. And the parents have no clue necessarily how to support piano practice or composition. Now, I've got great families. Now, I think if a family discovers their child is, a very interested tonal composer and has some talent for it, you're probably already dealing with a different kind of family than the family who's trying to fit piano in around 5 kinds of sports ball.
Yes, it's true. I started yesterday. I had a very, very young student, a little one. She's 4, and so she just had one lesson. And during her first lesson, I had asked her to make me a picture book for the following lesson with a story. She had to invent a story, nothing music related, just a story with pictures, and then give me this book for the lesson. And that despite the student didn't have any musical knowledge because she just started, she doesn't know where the notes are. She barely can distinguish 2 or 3 black keys right now. She had this way of imagining, okay, so something bad is happening, so let's go on the lower part of the piano, let's go there. And I think that if we would start proposing that to students over and over again since the very beginning, that would be, composition would be a little bit less scary also later, and less something like, oh, that's only for composers, right? It's only for people who are,
Absolutely. I encourage improvisation, and the students usually love it. It's the parents you sometimes have to convince. I have had a couple of parents say, well, that's a waste of lesson time if it's not, the prescribed repertoire. And I really try to educate the parents. Like, improvisation is part of getting around the musical language, because the kids usually love it. Unless sometimes these extremely anxious types won't be into it, but I think every single kid I've worked with, and I don't really have young piano students anymore, but they've always loved it. The adults will sometimes get into their own heads, but I'll encourage. I have a student who has a flute background, and her flute teacher had said, no, you don't play anything that's not on the page. And first of all, I was like, your teacher was covering up the fact that he probably felt insecure about composing and improvising himself, and I'm going to encourage all kinds of improvisation. And that's something we're specifically encouraging, because I think I need to erase what this teacher was erroneously telling her, because I think she could improvise very well if she would just let herself. But yeah, the kids, I think they find it a really fun, creative outlet immediately. And so, yeah, you're getting these kids into the Italian conservatories. They're probably thinking it's playtime.
Yeah, it's like a playground, so you can do whatever you want.
Hopefully the nuns are nicer than they were in my dad's Catholic school, from what I hear.
Yeah, it was. I think it was. I had a student composing something. I don't know if you know that song. I think it's The Roar or something. So it's a pop song, and a student learned that for the previous recital, and now she composed her own piece on that song. And she's just 9 right now. I think she's in 4th grade. So she composed her own piece based on that song, using the same chords, different type of accompaniment, but same harmonies. She modified a little bit. The rhythm is very similar, but she modified the right hand, and she modified the accompaniment. Harmonies are the same, and she came up with something beautiful, and she called it the Lion's Lullaby or something like that.
Yeah, that's great.
Why not? She learned the piece, and then she understood what the piece was about, the scheme of the piece, the patterns, without really, we didn't talk about, what type of chords are this, where are we going, what is the dominant, we didn't talk about that. But she recognized those chords are repeated. I can use the same chords to make my own music, and why not? I mean, at the very end, it's a choice we should give to students, and I think many more kids should kids or adults or whoever is learning music should also apply music writing to their own musical knowledge. Why do we learn a language and we learn how to write, read, and speak a language, and then we learn music and we think we should just play the music? We don't need to learn how to read and write that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of theories about why that's the case. I think it's just the 20th century, the advent of recording technology, and suddenly now every performance has to be absolutely note perfect, because recordings are absolutely note perfect, and no one really realizes what goes into. You're basically photoshopping recordings so that they're perfect. And then things got a lot more technically difficult, so people had to spend more time just drilling things. And so specialization became more of a thing. But then I know these composers who have no chops on an instrument or voice, and I'm thinking, how do you even compose if you can't play? And so I know, music schools that have lowered their performance standards for composition majors because composition majors weren't graduating because they couldn't get around performance on an instrument. And I'm not going to claim that I'm, Yun Chan Lim, but I don't think I could compose effectively if I weren't also performing and, having some empathy for performers.
Yeah. I don't know. As a pianist, I always find that some compositions would be unplayable for any pianist because the composer had not the pianist in mind.
Writing for piano is absurdly difficult unless you're a pianist. That's something I have to deal with a lot in my composition studio, is just showing composers how to write properly for the piano. And unless the composer is also a pianist, it's very, very difficult.
You have transcribed some of the accompaniment parts, right, for playable accompaniments.
Yeah, so some of these, a lot of these opera arias, there are always piano vocal scores that are published after an opera has come out so that coaches can work with the singers to prepare them before the orchestra comes in. Now, unfortunately, recording technology wasn't around when a lot of these reductions were made. So editors were just looking at the full score and cramming as much as they could onto 2 staves and not really keeping in mind what you actually hear when you're with the orchestra. Now we have recordings, and this is a little easier to do. Now, some editors still don't keep the orchestra part in mind, and they just kind of cram things onto the page. But what I have been doing, this is not a large percentage of my time, but it's just when I have a bit of time and a file to work with, I'll create playable reductions so that a singer can bring, a Strauss aria into an audition, and it's slightly less likely to get butchered if the audition pianist has to sight read. Yes. And knowing the schemata and the patterns that are being used is really helpful in knowing what to preserve, what the singer needs. I mean, I have seen reductions where the actual bass line is taken out. And I am thinking, who signed off on this? Everyone needs the bass line.
From the point of view of a pianist, and I accompanied a lot of people, but sometimes things are unreadable because you have too many notes. You have to sight read them. You have basically too many notes, and I always think, how many hours should I practice to play that at that speed and then be able to accompany this person? Because it would be really a lot of work for, and they don't pay, honestly, they don't pay enough. And I always thought, why don't they do that in the first place?
So there is actually, my friend Carol Jansen, she was the inspiration behind the accessible accompaniment. She created frustratedaccompanists.com, which is string reductions, because she, dealt with string teachers who sort of had mediocre piano chops, but needed to give their students something during lessons. And I thought to myself, why isn't there something like that for arias? Because audition pianists are always sight reading arias if they don't know them. And so that got that idea happening. And, I think my accompaniments end up being more involved than what Carol has, because I think it is a slightly different market. But I think singers have been really thankful for them. I also do audition cuts. And I think my background in Partimento and schema has really helped with that, because I know what to preserve and then make those patterns clearer for the audition pianist. Or, it might be a voice teacher who, their chops are sort of middling, but they need to work with their singer. Maybe the singer doesn't have an accompanist coming in. So they've really been useful, so I hear. I think the Wolf Trap Opera has this list of the arias that are most frequently offered for each voice type. And so for years, the top of the soprano list is always Pamina's aria from Magic Flute. And then I was able to publish an audition cut of what's called the Presentation of the Rose from Rosenkavalier. It's Strauss, so it is nasty. The problem is it's originally a duet between Octavian and Sophie. And so what these sopranos were doing, if they wanted to be Sophie and audition with that selection, they would be literally cutting pieces out of their score and pasting them together. And so when I did the reduction of that, I created a duet version, and then I created a Sophie cut. And so, Strauss went into public domain in Europe, and Sheet Music Plus, let me upload it, which I don't understand why they couldn't just vet where people were from when they were buying things if it wasn't public domain there, but so it's up. And then after the pandemic, when Wolf Trap auditions resumed, I noticed that Sophie was suddenly at the top of the list, and I wonder if maybe the availability of the Sophie cut encouraged more sopranos to actually bring that in.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we just avoid pieces just because we don't find the pianist. We think they're more difficult because of whatever reason. So yeah, having the scores there, that helps a lot. Yes, of course. So yeah, it was a great idea. I know you have to go, Nicole, and you have to teach. So yeah, I thank you so much for your time, and it was an enjoyable interview. And I will list your links in the description below the video, and
I'll throw in the link to the 22 Nocturnes, because I know I mentioned that. So those, this will probably be published after the premiere has happened, but hopefully there will be recorded footage. And but that's the 22 Nocturnes for Chopin. It can be purchased as a PDF. It's also available in hard copy from Music Room, and I think Hal Leonard Europe has their hands in a lot of music stores that it should be available at. I'm not super familiar with them, but Music Room is one that I'm familiar with. And it's in some brick and mortar stores in England, as I know someone who bought one. So it's around.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And so I hope, we talk, and very, very soon.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Well, thank you so much.